The stars never looked so unforgiving. Michael Harrington had always loved space, the silence of it. The endless expanse that seemed to go on forever with no beginning and no end. It was beautiful in a way that nothing on Earth could ever be. But it was also harsh, a cold wilderness with no sympathy for the weak or the unprepared. And now, as his ship spiraled out of control through the atmosphere of an uncharted planet, Michael was experiencing the cold indifference firsthand. The warning lights on the control panel flashed violently, cacophony of alarms filling the cockpit. His breathing was shallow, heart racing as his hands moved frantically over the controls, trying to stabilize the ship's descent. Sweat poured down his forehead, blurring his vision as the ship's hull shuddered under the force of entry. The heat outside was building, friction eating away at the protective layers of the ship, but Michael barely had time to think about it. Come on, he muttered through gritted teeth, fingers trembling as he fought the unyielding force of gravity. The atmosphere was thicker than expected, pulling him down faster than he had anticipated. He hadn't meant to crash, it had been a routine mission. His role as an explorer for the Intergalactic Research Division took him to unknown worlds, mapping planets for potential resources or habitability. This was just supposed to be another dot on the galactic map. But something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. A malfunction in the ship's navigation system had thrown him off course, and by the time he realized it, he had already been caught in the planet's gravity well. All attempts to re-engage the thrusters had failed. He was going down whether he liked it or not. The ground below was fast approaching, jagged mountains and forests that stretched into miles. There was no choice but to brace for impact. Gripping the harnesses that secured him to the pilot's seat, Michael squeezed his eyes shut as the ship careened toward the surface. A deafening crash. Metal groaned and twisted. The force of the impact slammed him against his seat, knocking the wind from his lungs. Pain shot through his body as the ship skidded along the ground, tearing through the alien landscape. Sparks flew, smoke filled the cabin, and for a moment everything went black. Michael awoke to silence, heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the soft hiss of the ship's dying systems. His head throbbed and every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he shifted in his seat. Blinking through the haze, he found the control panel dark, wires dangling from the ceiling and the once bright screens now cracked and flickering weakly. With a groan, he fumbled with the harness and managed to release himself from the seat, tumbling awkwardly to the floor. His limbs felt like lead, and it took several moments before he could force himself to stand. He limped toward the shattered viewport and peered outside. The landscape was unlike anything he had ever seen. The sky was an eerie shade of violet, with twin suns hanging low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the jagged, rocky terrain. Strange bioluminescent plants dotted the area, glowing faintly in the dim light. In the distance, towering trees with silver leaves swayed in the wind, their branches reaching upward like skeletal fingers. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The planet was beautiful in a way, but also dangerous. His eyes darted around, assessing his surroundings. The ship's hull had taken significant damage. There was no way it would fly again. His chances of signaling for help were slim. His emergency beacon was operational, but there was no guarantee that anyone would pick it up out here in the middle of nowhere. He was alone, stranded. Taking a deep breath, Michael forced himself into survival mode. He couldn't afford to panic. He grabbed the emergency pack from the storage compartment, which held limited food rations, water, a basic first aid kit, and a few survival tools. Not nearly enough for the long haul, but it would have to do for now. As he exited the wreckage of his ship, the crisp air of the planet hit him, cool but breathable. At least he didn't need a suit. That was something. He surveyed the land again, calculating his next steps. He needed to find shelter, water somewhere safe to regroup and figure out his next move. But before he could take more than a few steps, something caught his eye. A trail of blood. Alien blood. It glistened on the ground, a strange, silvery liquid, leading away from the crash site. His gut tightened. He wasn't alone. Instinct told him to be cautious, but curiosity got the better of him. He followed the trail, keeping his hand near the plasma pistol strapped to his side. The path wound through the rocky terrain, past the glowing plants, until it led him to a small, shallow cave hidden between two jagged cliffs. Inside, he found the source of the blood. Lying against the cave wall was a figure, an alien woman, her green skin pale and iridescent, her body covered in strange, jagged cuts. She was breathing, but just barely, her chest rising and falling in labored motions. Her eyes were closed, her face contorted in pain. She looked humanoid in shape, but utterly foreign. Her long, dark hair fanned out beneath her, and her limbs were slender, almost delicate, though there was a raw strength in her posture even in her weakened state. Michael froze. He had never seen anything like her. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, but she was also clearly in danger. His training as an explorer had prepared him for a lot of things, but nothing like this. Still, there was no time to hesitate. He had to act. Without thinking, Michael knelt beside her, gently pressing his fingers to her neck to check her pulse. It was weak but steady. She was alive, but she wouldn't be for long if he didn't do something. He quickly rummaged through his pack, pulling out the first aid kit. He wasn't sure how compatible human medicine would be with her physiology, but he didn't have a choice. Carefully, he cleaned her wounds, applying a biogel to stop the bleeding. She stirred slightly under his touch, but didn't wake. Her skin was warm, warmer than a human's, and it glowed faintly under the dim light of the cave. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how fragile she seemed, so different from the rugged explorers and soldiers he was used to seeing. And yet, there was something powerful about her, something that suggested she was no ordinary alien. Once he finished tending to her injuries, Michael leaned back on his heels and took a deep breath. He had done what he could. Now it was up to her body to heal, but he couldn't leave her here. She was vulnerable, exposed to the elements and possibly other dangers. He sat beside her, watching her for any sign of movement, unsure of what to do next. Hours passed, the planet's twin suns dipping below the horizon, casting the landscape into a deep, unnatural twilight. The glow from the plants intensified, bathing the cave in a soft, ethereal light. Michael's exhaustion began to catch up with him, but he refused to sleep. Not yet. Not yet. Suddenly the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and Michael found himself staring into them, large, dark eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies within them. For a moment they locked gazes, and in that instant, something passed between them. It wasn't words, but it was communication all the same. She was aware of him, of what he had done. She tried to speak, her voice a soft, musical sound, but the words were foreign, impossible to understand. Michael shook his head slightly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I don't understand you," he said softly, knowing she wouldn't understand him either. The alien woman blinked slowly, her gaze fixed on him. Then, with great effort, she lifted a hand and touched her chest. "Mira," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael frowned, but then realization dawned. "Mira," he repeated, pointing to her name. 9. She nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving his face. He smiled, though it felt strange in this surreal situation. "Michael," he said, pointing to himself. "My name is Michael." For a moment there was only silence between them. But it wasn't the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was the quiet understanding of two beings who, despite their differences, had found themselves bound by circumstances beyond their control, stranded, alone, and now, together. The following days were a blur of survival and learning. Mira recovered slowly, but her strength was returning, thanks in part to Michael's efforts to care for her. They couldn't speak to each other in any meaningful way, but they didn't need to. They communicated through gestures, expressions, and the shared struggle to stay alive on this strange planet. Michael learned that Mira was resourceful, guiding him to edible plants and clean water sources. She had an innate understanding of the planet, as if she had been here before, or had some kind of connection to it. She moved with a grace and purpose that fascinated him, even in her weakened state. One day, as they sat by a small fire near the cave, Mira reached for Michael's hand, her fingers warm against his skin. He looked at her, surprised by the sudden gesture. She spoke a few words in her alien tongue, and though he couldn't understand her, he knew what she meant. It was a thank you, an expression of gratitude for saving her life. Michael nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "You're welcome," he whispered, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. But it didn't matter. They understood each other in the ways that truly counted. The night sky was clear that evening, and Michael found himself staring up at the stars, wondering what the future held for them. He had been stranded before he knew the protocol, the steps he needed to take to signal for help. But now, as he looked over at Mira, who was resting peacefully beside him, he wasn't sure he wanted to leave so quickly. Something had shifted in him, something he hadn't expected. He didn't just see Mira as a survivor or even as an alien. She was more than that. She was a mystery, a connection to something larger, something he had yet to understand. And for the first time in his life, Michael felt that maybe the stars weren't so unforgiving after all. Michael sat by the flickering campfire, the embers casting warm, dancing shadows on the cavern walls. Outside, the two suns had set, leaving the alien world bathed in twilight. The bioluminescent plants surrounding the cave glowed faintly, their light casting an otherworldly aura over the landscape. Mira sat nearby, her green skin shimmering faintly in the soft light, her eyes distant as she gazed at the stars through the narrow opening of the cave. She was healing, Michael noted. Her movements were smoother, less labored. The cuts on her arms and legs, once deep and raw, were now thin scars, fading slowly against her iridescent skin. Yet there was something different about her tonight, something he couldn't quite place. Michael had gotten used to her silence, to the quiet moments they shared without the need for words. Their communication had improved rudimentary exchanges of simple ideas, small gestures that bridged the gap between their languages. But tonight, there was a weight in the air, a tension that Michael could feel even though neither of them had spoken for hours. He leaned back on his hands, glancing over at her. Mira sat cross-legged on the cool stone floor, her gaze fixed on the night sky. Her expression was serene, but her eyes, there was something in them, something contemplative, almost sad. "Are you okay?" Michael asked softly, knowing she wouldn't fully understand but hoping his tone would convey the question. Mira didn't look at him right away. She remained still, her fingers tracing delicate patterns in the dirt beside her. When she finally turned to him, her eyes were soft but distant, as if she were thinking about something far beyond the cave, beyond this planet. "Michael," she said, her voice quiet but clear, the sound of his name on her lips still foreign but familiar. She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You? Save me?" Michael smiled, though the weight in her voice made it feel bittersweet. "I had to," he replied gently. "I couldn't just leave you there." She shook her head slowly, her dark hair shimmering in the dim light. "No, you more, you brave, strong." He blinked, caught off guard by her words. Mira had never spoken like this before, never tried to express something so deeply. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, unsure of what else to say. But Mira wasn't finished. She lowered her eyes, her hands resting in her lap now, fingers curling into her palms. "You, different," she continued, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "Kind. No fear." Michael swallowed, the air suddenly feeling heavier between them. He wasn't sure where this was going, but something told him it was important. Something about her tone, about the way she looked at him, it made him feel like she was trying to tell him something. "I'm not that different," he replied quietly, his eyes searching hers. "I just did what anyone would do." Mira's lips curved into a small, sad smile. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not anyone." She fell silent again, her gaze drifting back to the stars. Michael followed her eyes, wondering what she was thinking about, what she saw up there in the vast, dark sky, the sky that stretched endlessly above them. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, and the sound of the alien night, the distant calls of strange creatures, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind filled the space between them. Michael felt a strange tightness in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, but something else. Something closer. The days had fallen into a rhythm since Michael had rescued Mira. They foraged for food together, explored the nearby terrain, and worked on improving their communication. Slowly, a bond had formed, one that felt deeper than just survival. But Mira had been changing, and Michael could see it in the small, subtle ways she acted around him. Her touch lingered just a little longer when their hands brushed, her eyes softened whenever they met his. She was different now. Not just physically recovering, but emotionally, as if something inside her had shifted. Mira, however, was keeping a secret. Deep in the night, when Michael was asleep, she would sit alone by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her mind heavy with thoughts of her homeworld, Salora. In her culture, the act of saving a life was not something to be taken lightly. It was sacred. It was binding. And it demanded a response. To Salorans, the highest form of gratitude, the ultimate gesture of respect and honor, was to give a gift, not a material object, but something much more profound, something that transcended the physical. It was a tradition that dated back thousands of years, one that carried deep spiritual and cultural significance. Mira's heart ached as she thought about it. She had never imagined being in this position, never thought she would owe such a gift to anyone, let alone an alien, a human so far from her own world. And yet, Michael had saved her. His bravery, his kindness had earned her respect in a way no one else had. He had shown her a kind of selflessness she had never known, risking his life to help a stranger from another world. And now, according to her people's traditions, she owed him the greatest gift she could offer, the gift of life, a child. The thought made her stomach twist with nerves. Though she showed none of it on her face, she couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not until she was certain he would understand, that he would accept what it meant. To Salorans, this was the ultimate act of gratitude, a bond that tied two beings together for eternity. But to humans, she wasn't sure. Mira glanced over at Michael, who was still sitting by the fire, his eyes distant as he stared into the flames. She wondered if he could ever comprehend the depth of her gesture, the weight of what she wanted to offer him. But she couldn't delay much longer. The time was approaching. Over the next few days, Mira's behavior became more purposeful, more deliberate. She started teaching Michael more about the planet, showing him where to find water sources, how to recognize the signs of dangerous wildlife, and what plants were safe to eat. It was as if she was preparing him for something, though Michael couldn't quite figure out what. One evening, as they sat by the fire again, Mira broke the silence. "Michael," she began, her voice low and serious. "You, Earth." He blinked, surprised by the question. "Yeah," he answered slowly, trying to gauge where this was going. "I'm from Earth." Mira nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Earth? Far." Michael sighed, leaning back on his hands. "Very far? I don't even know how far. I lost track when I crashed here." Mira's gaze dropped, and for a moment she was quiet again. Then she looked up at him, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite read. "You, go back." The question caught him off guard. He hadn't really thought about it. His emergency beacon was still active, but he wasn't sure if anyone had received it or if anyone ever would. The chances of being rescued felt slim. But still, the idea of going home, of leaving this strange planet behind, it hadn't crossed his mind in days. "I don't know," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I want to go back, but I don't know if I can. Not yet, anyway." Mira seemed to absorb his words carefully. Her eyes softened again, that distant look returning. "You save me," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "I no forget. No forget." Michael's heart gave a small, unexpected jolt. He had heard her thank him before, but this time it felt different. There was an intensity to her words, a gravity that made his chest tighten. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, Mira stood up abruptly. "I go," she said, pointing toward the cave entrance. "Look." "Look for what?" Michael asked, confused. She didn't answer, just gave him a small, mysterious smile before disappearing into the night. Mira wandered through the alien forest, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She had to find the right moment to offer Michael the gift, to explain what it meant in her culture, in her heart. But the fear gnawed at her. What if he didn't understand? What if he rejected it? Her people had always believed that the bond created by saving a life was sacred, that it transcended language, species, even time. But humans were different. Michael was different. He had shown her kindness, yes, but would he accept the depth of her gratitude? Would he understand that to her, giving him a child wasn't just about biology, it was about forging a connection, about honor, respect, and love. She had seen the way he looked at her, sometimes the quiet admiration in his eyes, the way his gaze softened when she spoke. She had felt the warmth in his touch, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. But did he feel it too? Did he feel what she felt? Mira's fingers brushed against her abdomen, her heart racing with the knowledge that soon, very soon, she would have to make her decision clear. She had already started the process, her body preparing for what would come. It was a part of her biology, an instinct passed down through generations of Silurians. The gift of life, the child, would be the ultimate symbol of their bond. But for now, she kept it hidden. The days passed in a quiet rhythm on the remote planet, a pattern of survival and discovery. Michael and Mira had developed an unspoken routine. Together, they foraged, explored, and tended to their small camp, growing more attuned to each other with each passing moment. The alien planet had transformed from a hostile, unknown wilderness into something more familiar, almost like a home. And yet, something lingered between them, a tension that neither had dared to address. Michael could feel it. He could sense a change in Mira, subtle but undeniable. Her presence had shifted. She had grown quieter, more thoughtful, as if something weighed on her. Her moments of deep contemplation had become more frequent. And when their eyes met, there was a new intensity in her gaze, something more profound, more deliberate. He tried not to overthink it, but it gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night when he lay awake, staring at the alien sky. One evening, after a long day of exploring the nearby forest, they returned to their cave just as the twin suns began to dip below the horizon. The violet sky darkened, casting deep shadows over the landscape. The glow of the bioluminescent plants intensified, filling the cave with their soft, otherworldly light. Michael sat by the fire, staring into the flames as he absent-mindedly poked at the embers with a stick. The warmth of the fire felt comforting after the cool of the night had begun to settle in. Mira sat across from him, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She had been silent for most of the evening, and though Michael was used to her quiet nature, tonight it felt different. He could feel her gaze on him, could sense the weight of something unsaid. "Mira," he said softly, not looking up from the fire. There was no immediate response, but he could feel her shifting, could hear the faint rustle of her movements. When he finally glanced up, he found her watching him with those large, dark eyes seemed to hold galaxies within them, eyes that had grown familiar to him in a crumbs. She took a deep breath, her expression serious, as if she had made a decision. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but steady. "Michael, we talk." Michael set the stick down and sat up straighter, sensing the gravity of her words. "Of course," he replied, his brow furrowing slightly in concern. "What's on your mind?" For a moment, Mira said nothing. She glanced away, her gaze drifting toward the cave entrance where the stars had begun to appear in the deepening sky. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the subtle shimmer of her iridescent skin. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost hesitant. "You saved me," she began, her words slow as if she were carefully choosing each one. "I never forget." Michael nodded, though he felt a strange tightness in his chest. They had spoken about this before, about how he had found her injured and helped her. But there was something different about the way she was speaking now, something heavier. "I'm glad I could help," he said gently, trying to meet her eyes. "But you don't owe me anything, Mira. You know that, right?" Mira's gaze flicked back to him, and for a moment, her expression softened. But then she shook her head, her dark hair catching the light as it swayed gently around her shoulders. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. "More than that." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to understand what she was trying to tell him. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully, sensing that whatever she was about to say was important, deeply important. Mira took another breath, her hands tightening around her knees. She seemed to be gathering her thoughts, her lips parting and closing again, as though the words were difficult to say. Finally, she looked at him, and in her eyes, Michael saw something he had never seen before: vulnerability. "In my world," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "to save life is sacred." Michael blinked, surprised by her words. He had never heard her speak about her culture in such a personal way before. She had mentioned bits and pieces of Silurian customs during their time together, but never in such depth. "Sacred," he repeated, trying to keep his voice gentle, encouraging her to continue. Mira nodded, her gaze not leaving his. "Yes, when someone saves life, they are bound forever." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly as if bracing herself for his reaction. "We give a gift of life." Michael's brow furrowed. He wasn't sure he understood what she meant. "A gift of life," he echoed, his confusion clear. Mira's eyes softened, and she let out a slow breath. "Yes," she whispered. "The greatest gift we can give is child." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Michael stared at her, his mind racing as he processed what she had just said. A child. Did she mean? You want to give me a child? He asked slowly, his voice barely audible. Mira nodded, her expression serious, but there was a gentleness in her eyes that told him this was not just a casual decision. This was something deeply important to her. Something rooted in her culture and her very being. Michael's heart raced, his mind spinning. A child. He had never expected this, had never even imagined such a possibility. The implications were overwhelming. He was human. She was an alien. The differences between them were vast, biological, cultural, everything, and yet, here she was, offering him the most profound gift her people could give. Mira, he began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to find the right words. I don't know what to say. She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting slightly in her lap. I know it is strange, she said softly. But it is our way. It is how we honor those who save us. I want to honor you, Michael. You have given me so much. Your kindness, your bravery. Michael felt a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't done any of it expecting something in return. He had just acted on instinct, on empathy. But now, standing before him was a woman from a different world, a different species, offering him something he had never even dreamed of. He swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. Mira, I don't know if I can accept that. I don't even know if it's possible. I mean, we're so different. Mira's gaze met his again, and this time there was a quiet determination in her eyes. It is possible, she said softly. My people. We have knowledge of genetics, of biology. Our bodies we can adapt. We can create new life, even with those who are different. Michael stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. The idea seemed so surreal, so impossible, and yet he believed her. He had seen enough on this strange planet to know that the universe was far more mysterious and vast than he had ever imagined. If anyone could make such a thing possible, it was Mira and her people. But it wasn't just about biology. There were so many other questions, other concerns. What kind of life could they give this child? How would the child fit into either of their worlds? What would it mean for both of them? Mira, he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. Her skin was warm under his touch, and he felt a spark of something deeper pass between them. This is huge. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with understanding. I know, she whispered. I know it is much to ask, but I want you to know. I choose this. I choose you. Her words sent a shiver down his spine. I choose you. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through together, the bond they had formed, the connection that had grown between them despite the vast differences in their species and their cultures. Michael felt something inside him shift, something that had been building for weeks but had finally reached its breaking point. He had felt it in the way he looked at her, in the way his heart ached when she was near. He had tried to ignore it, to push it away, telling himself that it was impossible, that they were too different. But now, as he sat here holding her hand, looking into her eyes, he realized the truth. He loved her. It wasn't the kind of love he had ever expected. It wasn't the kind of love he had ever known, but it was real, and it was deep, and it was undeniable. Mira, he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I think I love you. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of surprise. But then, her lips curved into a soft, beautiful smile, and she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. I love you too, Michael, she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry. If you're sure, then I want that too, he said quietly, his voice filled with both uncertainty and anticipation. I want to share this with you. Mira's eyes softened, and for a moment, they simply sat there, staring at each other in the glow of the fire, the weight of their decision hanging in the air. Then, slowly, Mira stood, her movements graceful and deliberate. She held out her hand to Michael, and without hesitation, he took it. They walked together, away from the fire, deeper into the cave where the soft light from the glowing plants illuminated their path. The air was cooler here, the distant sounds of the alien night creating a soothing backdrop to the moment that was about to unfold. When they reached the back of the cave, Mira turned to face him, her expression filled with both curiosity and tenderness. Show me, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Teach me. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer, his hands gently cupping her face. For a moment he hesitated, wanting to make sure she was completely comfortable. But when Mira leaned into his touch, her lips parting slightly, he knew she was ready. They kissed softly, their lips meeting in a delicate dance of exploration and connection. It was slow at first, tentative, but as the moments passed, the kiss deepened, their shared emotions flowing between them. Michael could feel Mira's body pressing against his, her warmth, her softness, her undeniable presence. Her hands rested on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. There was something almost sacred about the way they moved together, as if the universe itself had conspired to bring them to this moment. The boundaries between human and alien, between their two worlds, seemed to blur and fade, leaving only the raw, unfiltered connection between two souls. Their movements were slow, deliberate. There was no rush, no urgency, only the quiet, reverent unfolding of something new and beautiful. Mira's skin, glowing faintly in the dim light, was smooth and warm under Michael's touch, her iridescent sheen shimmering like the surface of water in the moonlight. She was otherworldly, yet in this moment she felt as real and tangible as anything he had ever known. Their bodies came together, soft gasps and whispers filling the air as they explored each other. Michael was careful, attentive, making sure Mira was comfortable every step of the way. Her reactions, her curiosity, only deepened his desire to make this experience as meaningful for her as it was for him. At one point, Mira pulled back slightly, her eyes wide with wonder as she looked down at their intertwined bodies. "This is beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You are beautiful." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "So are you, Mira?" "Myra?" The physical connection they shared felt different from anything Michael had ever experienced. It wasn't just about pleasure or desire, it was about discovery, about understanding each other on a level that went beyond words. It was as if they were rewriting the rules of intimacy, finding new ways to connect, new ways to express the love that had grown between them. As their bodies moved together in a rhythm that felt both ancient and new, Michael felt a deep, almost spiritual connection to Mira, as if they were merging not just physically but on a level that transcended the physical realm. It was as though their very souls were intertwined, dancing together in the light of the stars. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the moments blending into one another in a haze of sensation and emotion. Michael's breath was shallow, his heart racing as they reached the crescendo of their shared experience. Mira's soft gasps filled the air, her body trembling beneath his touch, and in that moment Michael knew that something had changed, something profound and irreversible. When it was over, they lay together in the soft glow of the cave, their bodies entwined, their breathing slow and steady. Michael held Mira close, his hand gently stroking her hair as she rested her head on his chest. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. They had said everything that needed to be said without speaking, had communicated through touch and breath and heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, Mira lifted her head and looked at him, her dark eyes filled with warmth and wonder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and sincere. Michael smiled, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "No," he said gently, "thank you." Mira smiled back, her expression filled with quiet contentment. "Now," she whispered, resting her hand over his heart, "I understand you, Michael, in a way I never thought possible." Michael's heart swelled with emotion, his throat tightening as he looked into her eyes. "And I understand you too, Myra," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion, "in a way that I never imagined." They lay together in the quiet of the cave, their bodies warm and close, the soft glow of the bioluminescent plants casting a gentle light over them. Outside, the alien world continued its quiet song, the stars twinkling in the sky, and the universe vast mysterio. In the days that followed, Mira began to explain more about her people's customs, about the sacred gift of life that she wanted to give him. She told him about Siloran biology, about how their bodies were capable of adapting to create new life with those from other species. She explained the deep spiritual significance of the gesture, how it was a bond that would tie them together forever, not just as lovers, but as partners, as parents. Michael listened to everything she said, his heart heavy with the magnitude of it all. He still wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew one thing for certain: he wanted to be with her. He wanted to see where this path would lead them. And so one night, as they sat together under the stars, he took her hand and looked into her eyes. "Let's do it," he whispered, his voice filled with both fear and hope. "Let's create this life together." Mira's eyes filled with tears, and she smiled, a smile so radiant it took his breath away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for accepting my gift." And in that moment, as they held each other under the alien sky, Michael realized that their journey had only just begun. From that night on, their bond deepened in ways Michael hadn't thought possible. The planet no longer felt like a place of survival, it felt like the beginning of something new, something beautiful. Mira's body began to change soon after, subtle at first but unmistakable. She was carrying their child, the physical embodiment of their connection, their love. It was a strange and wondrous thing to witness, and Michael found himself filled with both awe and trepidation. The pregnancy progressed differently than what he might have expected for a human. Mira's body seemed to glow, her skin taking on an even more radiant sheen, her movements graceful despite the changes happening within her. She was strong, resilient, and yet there were moments of vulnerability, moments when Michael would catch her staring off into the distance, her hand resting protectively over her abdomen, as if lost in thought. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mira placed her hand over Michael's and guided it to her growing belly. "Feel," she whispered. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he felt the faintest flutter beneath his palm, the undeniable movement of their child. It was real. It was happening. And in that moment, all of his doubts, all of his fears seemed to melt away, replaced by a deep, unshakable sense of wonder. Their days became a blur of anticipation and quiet moments of connection. Michael found himself more in tune with the planet, more at peace with the strangeness of their situation. He and Mira were building something together, something no one could have imagined. And though there were still challenges ahead, they faced them together. The child growing within Mira wasn't just a symbol of their love. It was a bridge between two worlds, two species, a living testament to the bond they had formed. And as the days passed, Michael found himself looking forward to the future, not just for himself and Mira, but for the child they would soon bring into the universe. A child born from love, from sacrifice, and from the sacred gift that had bound them together forever. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time Michael felt a sense of hope, a hope that transcended the stars, the planet, and everything he had known before. And it all began with the gift Mira had chosen to give him, the gift of life. The days after Michael had agreed to accept Myra's sacred gift had passed in a strange blend of anticipation, awe, and a deepening sense of connection. The planet's twin suns continued their rhythmic dance across the sky, casting long shadows in the alien twilight, but for Michael, time had taken on a new quality. It stretched and contracted, each moment with Mira filled with both discovery and waiting. The changes in Mira's body were becoming more pronounced with each passing day. Her once slim figure had grown fuller, her belly now visibly rounded, a testament to the new life she carried within. But unlike human pregnancies, Mira's transformation was marked by something more ethereal. Her skin, already luminous, had taken on a faint, pulsing glow that intensified when the child moved inside her. Her eyes shone brighter, as if the very energy of the planet and the universe itself was coursing through her. Michael found himself both fascinated and overwhelmed. This wasn't like anything he had ever imagined, not even in his wildest dreams. He had always thought of parenthood in human terms: diapers, sleepless nights, first steps. But this was something far more profound, far more extraordinary. He was witnessing the birth of something entirely new, a union of two species, two worlds. Mira seemed at peace with the changes, though there were moments when Michael could see the weight of what was happening pressing on her. At night, when they lay beneath the stars, she would often place her hand on her stomach, her expression distant, contemplative. Michael would lie beside her, his hand resting over hers, feeling the faint movements of the child they had created together. "You feel her," Mira whispered one night, her voice soft and filled with wonder. Michael nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "I do? It's incredible?" Mira smiled, turning her head to look at him, her dark eyes glowing faintly in the starlight. "She is strong. Like you." Michael chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't know about that. I think she gets her strength from you." Mira's smile widened, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Michael couldn't quite understand. He had seen it before, in quiet moments when she thought he wasn't watching. It was as if something weighed heavily on her, something she hadn't yet told him. "What is it, Mira?" he asked gently, reaching out to brush a strand of her hair away from her face. "You've been distant lately. Is something wrong?" For a moment she didn't respond. Her eyes flickered away, her fingers tightening slightly over his. Then she sighed, a deep, weary sound, and turned back to him. "I fear." For her, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what she will be. For what the universe will expect of her." Michael's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mira's gaze drifted back to the stars. "She is the first of her kind. A child born from two worlds, two species. She will carry the weight of both. I fear what that will mean for her, for us." Michael's heart tightened in his chest. He had thought about this too, late at night when sleep refused to come. Their child, Leora, as they had decided to name her, would be something entirely new, a bridge between two civilizations, two ways of life. But with that uniqueness came uncertainty. What kind of life could they give her? What kind of world would she be born into? "We'll figure it out," Michael said softly, squeezing her hand. "We'll make it work. We have to." Mira's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she nodded, her lips trembling as she tried to smile. "I know, I worry." Michael leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You're not alone in this, we'll do it together. All three of us." Mira closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I trust you, Michael. I trust us." And with those words, the tension seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet resolve. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain: they were in this together. The birth happened sooner than either of them had expected. It began in the middle of the night, when the air was still and the planet's twin moons bathed the landscape in a pale, silvery light. Michael had been sleeping lightly, as he had taken to doing ever since Mira's pregnancy had advanced, always half alert in case she needed him. When he felt her hand on his shoulder, gentle but urgent, he was immediately awake. "Michael," she whispered, her voice tight with pain. "It's time." His heart leaped into his throat. He scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling slightly as he helped Mira sit up. She was breathing heavily, her face pale but determined, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice tight with both fear and excitement. Mira nodded, wincing as another contraction rippled through her. "Yes, she is coming." Michael's mind raced. They were far from any kind of medical help, far from the technology of Mira's world or the familiarity of his own. He had no idea what to expect. Would the birth be like a human birth, or would it be something entirely different? But there was no time to dwell on it. Mira needed him. He helped her lie back on the makeshift bedding they had created in the cave, his heart pounding in his chest. The fire flickered nearby, casting long shadows on the walls, while outside, the alien night remained eerily quiet, as if the entire planet was holding its breath in anticipation. Mira gripped his hand tightly, her eyes squeezed shut, as another wave of pain coursed through her. Her skin was glowing more brightly now, her entire body radiating with an almost supernatural light. Michael had never seen anything like it. She looked ethereal, otherworldly, a goddess of life and creation. Breathe, he whispered, his voice trembling. I'm right here, Mira. I'm not going anywhere. Myra nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she fought through the pain. Her body was strong, but even she was struggling. Michael could see the strain in her face, the way her muscles tensed with each contraction. But through it all, she never let go of his hand. Time seemed to blur. Michael lost track of how long it had been, how many hours had passed. All he knew was that Mira was fighting, that their child was coming, and that he had never felt more helpless in his life. And then, finally, it happened. Mira let out a low, guttural cry, her entire body tensing as one final, powerful contraction tore through her. And then, in an instant, the tension broke, replaced by a profound stillness. Michael's heart raced as he leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. And then, in the dim light of the cave, he saw her, their daughter. Leora. She was small, delicate, but unmistakably alive. Her skin was a soft, pale green like Mira's, but with a faint golden hue that seemed to shimmer in the firelight. Her eyes were closed, her tiny chest rising and falling with her first breaths, and her hair dark, silken, and faintly glowing clung to her scalp in soft waves. Michael stared in awe, his entire body trembling with emotion. She was perfect. A miracle. A child born from two worlds, two species, a union of the impossible. Mira let out a shaky breath, her body sagging with exhaustion, but there was a radiant smile on her face as she looked at their daughter. She is beautiful, she whispered, her voice filled with both wonder and relief. Michael nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. He reached out, gently cradling Leora in his arms, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it took his breath away. This tiny, fragile being, she was theirs. She was the embodiment of everything they had fought for, everything they had hoped for. Hi, Leora, Michael whispered, his voice trembling as he gazed down at his daughter. Welcome to the world. Mira watched him with tear-filled eyes, her expression soft and full of love. She is strong, she whispered. She will do great things. Michael nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He knew Mira was right. Leora was more than just a child. She was a symbol, a beacon of hope for both their species, for the universe itself. Her existence proved that love, understanding, and unity could transcend the boundaries of species, culture, and worlds. The following days were a blur of recovery and awe. Mira, though exhausted from the birth, healed quickly, her body regaining its strength in ways that astounded Michael. She was resilient, powerful, and yet so gentle with their daughter. Every time she looked at Leora, there was a quiet reverence in her eyes, a deep, unspoken bond between mother and child that transcended words. Michael, too, found himself transformed by the experience. Holding Leora in his arms, watching her tiny chest rise and fall with each breath, feeling her soft skin against his, he had never felt anything like it. It was as if the entire universe had narrowed down to this one moment, to this one tiny being who held so much promise, so much potential. As Leora grew stronger, Michael and Mira found themselves talking more and more about the future. What kind of life could they give her? How would she fit into the larger universe? A child born from two worlds? She will be a bridge, Mira said one evening as they sat by the fire, Leora sleeping peacefully in her arms. She will bring our people together, help them understand that we are not so different. Michael nodded, his heart swelling with pride and hope. I believe that, he said softly. She's special, Mira. She's going to change everything. Mira smiled, her eyes glowing softly in the firelight. Yes, she whispered. She will. It was just after dawn when the signal came. Michael had been outside the cave, gathering wood for the fire, when the familiar sound of a transmission reached his ears. His heart leaped in his chest as he raced back to the cave, his pulse pounding in his ears. Mira, he called out, his voice breathless with excitement. It's a signal. Someone's coming. Mira looked up from where she was cradling Leora, her eyes widening in surprise. A signal, she repeated, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Michael nodded, his chest tight with anticipation. Yes. It's a rescue ship. From your people. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, a smile spread across Mira's face and she nodded. It is time, she said softly. They have come for us. The Shaloran rescue ship arrived just as the twin suns were rising over the horizon, casting a golden light across the landscape. The ship was sleek, metallic, and unlike anything Michael had ever seen, a testament to the advanced technology of Mira's people. As the ship touched down, the hatch opened, and a group of Shaloran diplomats emerged, their green skin and glowing eyes similar to Mira's. They approached cautiously, their gazes filled with curiosity and wonder as they took in the sight of Mira, Michael, and the tiny child in Mira's arms. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one of the diplomats, an older Shaloran with silver hair and piercing eyes, stepped forward. He looked at Mira, his expression softening. You have returned, he said softly, his voice filled with both relief and awe. Mira nodded, her gaze steady. Yes, and I bring with me a new beginning. The diplomat's eyes flicked to Leora, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled, a small, gentle smile that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 possibilities. This child, he said softly, she is extraordinary. Mira nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "She is the future," she whispered. Michael stood beside them, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked at the Tsilarian diplomat, Mira, and finally at Leora, who was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. This was the beginning of something new, something extraordinary. As the Tsilarian ship prepared to depart, Michael found himself standing at the edge of the landing site, watching the planet they had called home for so long disappear behind the rising suns. Mira stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, while Leora slept soundly in her embrace. The future was uncertain. They didn't know what awaited them in the vast expanse of space, what challenges they would face as they navigated the complexities of their two worlds. But for the first time in his life, Michael felt a sense of peace, of hope. They had each other. They had Leora, and together, they would face whatever the universe had in store. As the ship rose into the sky, leaving the alien world behind, Michael took one last look at the planet, the place where everything had begun. And then, with Mira by his side and Leora in his arms, he turned toward the stars. The universe was vast, filled with mysteries and wonders beyond imagination, but in that moment, as they soared into the unknown, Michael knew one thing for certain. Love, true, deep, and powerful, was the greatest force in the universe. It could bridge the gap between worlds, between species, between everything that seemed to divide them. And in Leora, that love would shine brighter than the stars.